Hello, I'm Emma Desi and welcome to another episode of Turning Readers into Writers. If you're brand new here, welcome, and here's what you need to know. This is a community that believes you are never too old to write your first novel. No matter what you've been up to until now, if you're ready to write your book, I'm ready to help you reach the end. I focus on helping you find the time and confidence to begin your writing journey, as well as the craft and skills you need to finish the book. Each week I interview debut authors, editors and industry experts to keep you motivated, inspired and educated on all things writing, editing and publishing. If you want to catch up, head on over to emmadesi.com where you'll find a wealth of information and tools to help you get started. Before we dive in, this week's episode is brought to you by my free cheat sheet, 30 Top Tips to Find Time to Write. In this guide, I give you 30 ways that you can find time to write in the small gaps that appear between the various errands and tasks and responsibilities that you have in your day-to-day life. Now, you might be thinking that you don't have any time to spare, but I can guarantee these top tips will give you writing time you didn't think you had. If you thought writing always involved a pen and paper or a keyboard, think again. If you thought you needed at least an hour at a time to write your manuscript, I help you reframe that. You won't be disappointed. Get your free copy of 30 Top Tips to Find Time to Write by going to emmadesi.com/30 top tips. Okay, let's dive in to today's episode. Welcome back to another episode of Turning Readers into Writers, and I continue the Author Accelerator series with a wonderful session with Bethany Tucker, who I'm very pleased to say has become a friend of mine, and she is going from strength to strength. She is one of two co-hosts for the podcast Doing Diversity in Writing, and she writes young adult fantasy as Mustang Rabbit, as well as dark fantasy as Kira Darren. Her identities as a practicing pagan, a bisexual woman, and former member of an ultra-conservative Christian cult all inform her creative work. Her final thesis at Denison University was on art and literature as tools of political propaganda in communist China. She has lived and worked in China, as well as South Korea, Japan, teaching English and cross-cultural communication, and she now offers developmental editing and coaching to fiction writers, which she will tell you more about in our conversation today. This is, this is a heavy-going episode. She really takes you through all the things that you need to know about doing a structural element, highlighting the key things you want to be looking at, identifying questions you want to be asking yourself as you go along, and offering a very, very needed reminder that you will do multiple passes of your structural edit. You'll be looking at different things as you go through. You'll be correcting things. You'll be improving upon things. You'll be noticing things you didn't on the first pass. So really good to know that these are skills and tools that you can learn for yourself, that you can use as you go forward with your writing. So if this is your first book, you'll be wanting to use these tools in revision. As you get more experience, these are things that you'll be able to implement straight away from the get-go when you do your first draft, which will make the revisions much more easier at the back end. But enough from me. Let us find out more about Bethany and what she's going to be teaching you. So in your bio there, it says that your pen name is Mustang Rabbit, and I love the name, but I wonder if you could tell us how you came up with this name.
I've had interesting reactions from people from the pen name. As a child, I fell in love with Mustangs. I live in the western part of the United States, so they roam free in some areas on reserve. And it was just a symbol of freedom, of strength. Horses live in community, so it had this idea of being with each other and running. And then rabbit, I was born in the year of the rabbit. I was born in 1987. And I lived in China. That's the year of the rabbit. And there's something fast and playful about it. When I was writing YA fiction, I was like, I want a playful name. I want this freedom. There's that energy around youth and exploring yourself. That YA arc is usually about finding yourself. Mm-hmm. So I went with that.
Very fitting. It's very fitting.
All right. So we're talking about editing for structure. It's probably good that you can't see me because we have so much to cover today that I will be checking my phone and pacing myself. I think editing for structure is one of the biggest things that we can do as writers. So what are we going to talk about? Self-editing for structure, specifically for people who are in their first 1 to 3 books or so. I think everybody can find something in this talk that's going to be useful to them, but I'm specifically focusing on those first few experiences of, I have this story and I know I need to edit it, but what do I do now? We often come out as very different writers, even different people through this process the first few times. So we'll cover that. We'll cover the basic pillars of story because that's what we'll be editing for as in the structure. I break it down into 6. There's people who break it down into different ways. So my way is not necessarily the only way to do it. We have a lot of language around writing, and feel free to just relate it to the language that you use best. We'll be covering some concrete steps and tools to self-edit, including some very honest pictures of my own tools and what they look like. And then we'll be talking about editing subject matter. So when we're editing, we're not just editing like the plot and how we put the words on the page. We're also editing like how we talk about the things we talk about and what we talk about. So hopefully that will be engaging. What we won't talk about. I love squirrels, so hopefully you enjoy the picture. We will not be talking about grammar, word choice, length of chapters, paragraphs, paraphrasing, or proofreading. For one, that is not my greatest strength. I read so fast that I often don't see typos, which is why I often ask, I make sure I have plenty of people to read my things for me. It's the way my brain works. I'm working with the larger picture and how it affects the reader. So when you eventually do get a professional editor, do see what their strengths are, what they really lean into. So for me, I lean into developmental editing, also known as substantive editing. In this case, editing for structure. So who am I? My pen name is Mustang Rabbit, as Emma introduced me. Thank you, Emma. I'm editor at the Art and Science of Words. That sounds very pretentious. It's just me, and I love it that way. I've been a teacher. I pretty much end up teaching no matter what I do, and I'm a book dragon. The title was first conferred on me by my father as he saw how many bags of books I was dragging home from the library. Bookworm was not a sufficient title. So this year I published 3 books, Adelaide and the Dragon Castle, Adelaide and the Pirates, Adelaide and the Merfolk, under my YA pen name. So if you want to check those out, kind of see who I am as a writer, feel free to do that. I always suggest that you certify who you're getting your advice from. All right, I'm going to be talking somewhat quickly. Tell me if it's too fast. What is structure? Structure is pretty much everything, and everything that I'm in love with story. Structure is plot. If you don't have plot, you have a random series of events, and they just happen one after another. And although there is some writing out there that tries and experiments with this, you won't find it in mainstream genre fiction or even most literary fiction. Though some literary fiction does do this, but you need the plot to kind of take the reader from one place to the next. Setting informs the plot. You can take plots and put them in so many different settings. I mean, Romeo and Juliet has been done 1,000 times in different settings, but each one is different, partially because your setting is different for that story. It gives the story the plot possibilities. It also limits it, which in a way improves it. Characters. These are the subjects of the story. They interact with the plot and the setting. They drive it, they control it, they are also subjected to it. which is kind of amazing. I remain fascinated by that. Backstory. You might say that this is part of your characters or your setting, but the way you handle it and when you're editing, I find backstory to be something that needs to be handled very clearly as backstory on its own. So I've included it in the 6. And then voice. I'm not going to talk about voice a lot, but it is your unique fingerprint, and you do need to be aware of it. And then point of view, which I will probably say POV a lot, so I'm just going to say point of view is POV right here. It's the camera lens through which your reader experiences the story. I find that as I'm working with writers who are kind of new to working with point of view, POV, very consciously, just think about it as the camera that controls how the story is experienced. All right, so discovery writers versus planners. Not everyone knows the terminology. I'll break it down really quickly. Discovery writers, pretty much, that's when you grab the pencil, you grab the page, your book, notebook, and sit down and start writing. And you kind of have an idea in your head and you're excited about it and you're like, okay, I'm going to go for it. But you don't have this full plan. You're figuring it out as you go. This is where most of us start as writers. And some people spend their entire lives here. I think some of the most famous are Stephen King as a discovery writer. But if you are a discovery writer, you really, really do need to edit for structure once you're done, because you may or may not know where you're going. And once you get to the end, it could be different. And you have to look at that structure once you're finished. On the opposite end of the scale from discovery writers, you have planners. I fall somewhere in between, but I'm 70% a planner now after 20 plus years of writing. Even if you are a planner, though, you're actually applying most of the structure before you start writing the prose, before you're like chapter 1 and the first sentence. You're adding the structure to the story so you know where you're going. So if you're a planner, this still applies to you. If you are somewhere in between, this still applies to you. It's just when you apply it, and even when you are finished writing, if you start with a plan, if you start plotting and you write exactly to it, you still need to ask yourself all these questions at the end to make sure you really accomplished what you wanted. All right, I'm only going to give you one rule, one hard and fast rule. Write to the end. Do not, although much of what we're going to talk about today is going to be applicable before you reach the end, you really need to write your book to the end before you're ready to do a full structural edit. Why? It will save you years of work. I'm going to credit Michael Stackpole for first explaining to me what write to the end means. And he was on a podcast, his own podcast, and he just said, write to the end. You've got to write to the end. And a year and a half later is when I had my first book that I could really hand to someone. I eventually published, and I had just been going around and around the hamster wheel, like editing as I went, editing that, going back, and never actually finishing. And you can't edit towards a goal that you can't see. So there's just this, you have this story, and if you're editing before you finished, you're editing to something that's not quite clear yet. Oftentimes I'll be working with a writer and they'll reach the end of their book and realize they're writing a book that they didn't expect. And if you've been editing and editing towards something that isn't actually what you're going for, you're going to have to redo all of that edit. And you could spend years on a project that if you only finished it, then you could look at the whole thing and see, oh, this is what I'm really trying to say. So that's it. That is your one rule. If you don't get anything else out of this talk, remember, write to the end, then go back and do your structural edit. All right, so the 6 pillars. The first one is setting. There are a lot of craft books. There are a lot of explanations out there how to write your settings. So I'm mostly going to focus on questions to ask once you've reached the end and you've started editing. Do I abide by the rules I've set up in this story? I cannot emphasize this enough. Every story has rules in it. These are the limitations. So like in Harry Potter, one of the rules is don't do magic in front of muggles. And this rule becomes a difficulty for Harry and his friends and other people throughout the story. It creates limits, which creates possibilities. We actually do want limits in our stories, and a lot of those limits come from settings. We need to have those clearly set up. So the thing about rules, they only work if the reader knows about them. So take a good look at your book and say, have I clearly stated these rules? Does the reader know about them? And do they happen in the first 25% of my book? Because you can't, if you lay out a rule in the last 25% of your book right before the end, and then it's important to the final scene, the reader's like, what, that just happened? There's no build up. The reader can't feel that. It can almost feel like cheating to suddenly create a problem for your reader. So if there is a rule that's important for the final conclusion of your book, you probably should allude to it even in passing in the first 25% of your book. Look at the impact of class, gender, race, and social roles as they affect your characters. These are also all rules that you've written into your own story. Make sure you're following them. Oftentimes, as we're like writing, especially discovery writing, we're like, oh, that's inconvenient. I'm not going to pay attention to that right now. It doesn't work. Once you break your own rules, you've kind of broken a contract with your reader. So you either need to go and change those rules in your setting, or you need to rewrite your story to abide within your own rules. Oftentimes, it can be difficult to see this, so be really honest with yourself. Write out a list of your rules if you need to, and then gut check, like even say it out loud to yourself, like, does this fit into my rules? Fantasy is not the only one. Sci-fi, not the only one. You can have real rules in a real world setting, like this person works a certain kind of job and these are the hours they work. Well, unless you can get them out of their job for some reason, that is a rule in the story. They work these hours and they have to be at work. See if your setting conflicts with your characters or your plot. Are they a match? Do they work well with each other, or are they fighting each other? Sometimes you write a story and you realize it needs to be set somewhere else, which can be hard to tell yourself, but it's okay. It can often be negotiated. Just make sure that you know. Like, if you set a story that is very much focused on like high court intrigue, but they're always in like small little towns, are you really getting the full effect of your high court intrigue? Take a moment, think about it. And then make sure that you've built logic and reality into your story. For example, if you have a tribe of people in your alternative universe, secondary world fantasy, that are supposed to be famous horseback riders, but you have them living high up in the mountains, where basically you need a mountain goat to get anywhere, it doesn't really work. You're going to have a difficulty with your reader explaining that, because it's hard to feed horses up there, and it's hard to get good at riding horses when there's no straight land or etc. So you're going to have to work with that, make sure that there's a place for that, or change it and have them famous for something else other than horseback riding. All right, pillar 2, characters. I've broken this down into full cast and the main characters. So I could speak on this for over an hour. We're going to keep it very short. Make sure you're asking yourself, based on my characters' backstories, are these actions believable? Because oftentimes, especially when we're just in that flow, we're in our first couple books, and we're thinking, oh, I need to make this happen in my story, we have a character do something that's not supported by the character's backstory. So we're like, oh, why is this person speaking Spanish here? Did you set it up that they can speak Spanish? You need to take a look. And these things are always negotiable. You can change the backstory, you change the language that they're speaking, but make sure that you built that believability into the story. Otherwise, again, you're breaking contract with your reader and you're going to lose them. Do the emotional reactions of each character make sense, given their history and situation? So if you've had someone be super emotional the whole story, and then something happens and they're not emotional, have you set it up for them to not be emotional? Are they in shock? Have they been faking it the whole time and this is their true reality? Are they coming through and this is their character arc? Make sure that you've set that up to be believable to the reader. Making a jump with a character's emotional reaction is one thing that can really mess readers up and say, oh, I didn't believe anymore. Examine all your scenes. Make sure that the characters are acting within their capacity. So don't have someone get really good at sword fighting in the course of a week if you haven't set up that sword fighting in your world can be learned in the course of the week. If it's a Matrix and you can download sword fighting into your brain, great. If you're a medieval knight, you probably need a couple of years of training to make that happen. All right, main characters. Do you have an inner and outer arc for your main character? This is one thing I talk about a lot with writers, is there's always that internal journey inside of yourself, making yourself able to make the decisions that you make outward. And then there's always the external problem, the external goal, the external challenges. These are two journeys that interlock with each other and both have to come through. If you're writing a thriller and it's a big long series and the readers are very familiar with the character, the main character, the inner arc may be quite subtle. It should still be there. There should still be an existential threat to the interior part of your character, their inner self. But the outer plot is probably going to be much more the focus. Even so, reading fiction is an emotional experience, and you have to attend to that emotional part of the reader experience. So you have to attend to the emotional part of your character. Make sure that you can articulate both of these arcs, that you know what they are. It can be difficult when we're looking at this big, vast thing that we've written, and it has 3 heads and 10 tentacles, and we're trying to make it into a person-shaped object, to know exactly what these arcs are. So I would suggest taking something like the hero's journey, the heroine's journey, the archetypes, either like Carl Jung or the tarot archetypes or some other archetypes that works for you, and sit down and figure it out. Where does my character start and who do they become? Does my character start out as the fool and become the triumphant hero at the end with peace and prosperity? Do they start out as a hermit and become, a judge that can speak their truth to the world that they've brought down from the mountains? It doesn't actually matter too much what it is, but it needs to be there. It needs to speak to the plot. It needs to speak to the setting that you've set up. It all needs to hang together. And can you articulate your character's backstory? Even if the reader doesn't ever really know, you need to know, because it will inform how you write it and it will make cohesion throughout the story. All right, before I talk about characters too much, plot and pacing. This one is a biggie, but it is totally doable. So we will go into the mechanics of checking plot and pacing because it can be really hard to get away from it. But here's some questions to go over first. Do you have your timeline sketched out and have you checked for plot holes? We will come back to this. Do you have characters? Do you give characters a plausible amount of time to deal with shock, wound healing, emotional reactions, sleep, etc.? For me, a personal pet peeve is when someone gets shot or stabbed, something that would necessitate serious medical attention, and they walk it off and they're just fine. If you are writing a story like that, set it up, figure it out, make sure that you haven't shot someone through an artery. I was helping someone edit something once, and they were doing really well, and then they cut someone's artery on the leg, which the way they cut it, and I double-checked this with a medical professional, they would have bled out within minutes. Google a medical professional, whatever you need to do, but double-check that you've done this, and that the recovery times are reasonable. Now, there's a lot of things we can fudge, especially in fantasy. We can introduce magic. In sci-fi, we can introduce, advanced medical attention. Even in real world, like modern day plots, we can use, new therapies or make sure the bullet went a certain way so it's just a flesh wound. Just double check it. It could seem really bad, and then you find out someone was wearing a bulletproof vest, and they just got knocked out by the force of the explosion or the bullet impact. But double check it. Are travel times consistent? And check that against logic governing the world in which you are writing. So you basically want to make sure that if you have your main character traveling from city A to city B in chapter 2 and it takes them 3 days, you want to make sure that it takes them 3 days or some other logical estimation in that time range later if they do the same trip, or another character takes the same trip. Or you explain the difference in time, like one of them took a train and the other one drove. Make sure you know what those distances are. It can be difficult because often we're like, oh, I'm just going to send it to the city. And then later we do the same thing and we forget. It happens all the time. Check your middle. There can often be, especially in discovery writing, a lot of like, oh, they did this and they did this, and it kind of gets slow and meandering. Some people call it the soggy middle. If you have that, we're going to come back to that because that needs to be tightened up. The reader's not going to stick around for that. One way to know if you have some of this going on is if there are any scenes that you found too boring to write as yourself, as an author, or if you will not reread it yourself because you're like, oh, that's boring, I go to sleep when I read it. If there is a scene you find boring, you probably need to find a way to cut it, put any information from that scene in another scene, or rewrite the scene altogether. You are your own first test object. Checking the time here. Okay. Are there any plot lines that are not wrapped up? If your book is in a series, this is okay. There will be a plot line in each book that you really should wrap up, but you also need plot lines that are open. A lot of advice will be like, finish the main plot arc and then leave an open wound or a cliffhanger for something and start the new plot arc. All right, so this has to do more with like the arcs. You need to define the stakes within the first 25% of the book. If you can do it in the first 10, even better. This doesn't mean that you can't up the stakes later, but what's at risk, what's at play, needs to be very obvious to the reader so they know why they're sticking around to find out what happens. I like to break books up into 25% sections, and this needs to happen in that first quarter words that you've written. The goal often is tangled up in the stakes, but may be somewhat different. So make sure you also have that solidified. For example, in Harry Potter, there's the stake of him being able to stay in the magical world. There's also the stakes of defending against Voldemort, finding out what's going on in the castle. All these things get layered in, but it's always very clear. So make sure you're doing that. It doesn't have to be as blatant as Harry Potter necessarily, but everyone needs to know why they're reading your book. Does the character get what they want the first time? They really, really shouldn't. Rule of thumb doesn't have to be there all the time. It's not like the rule that I said earlier. But rule of thumb is they should try 3 times for everything they want. And it can be a little bit different each time. It should be. But you don't give them what they want the first time. Much like in real life, we often don't get what we want the first time. Or it makes a better story if we have to struggle for it. And then make sure the resolutions are clear. Even if it's not the resolution they want, or if it's like a resolution that comes in from the side, make sure your challenges are addressed. So if there's a challenge, the challenge either needs to morph very obviously into something else, or you need to resolve it directly. Look at the book, make sure you're not using, I'm not very good at saying Latin, but Deus ex machina. I know I just said that, but it translates to God in the machine. And this is basically like you make a new character that shows up at just the right moment to save everybody at the end of the book because you wrote yourself into a plot corner and you can't figure out how to get them out. That's fine in your first draft. Put it in there. Give yourself a note. Put this new character in earlier in the book. Set this up better because these problems can always be fixed in editing. In fact, you really, really need to. Otherwise, the reader is like, well, they just got rescued. What was the point? And then, are there any decisions or events that wouldn't make sense with just the information in your book? This happens sometimes. Like I'm editing for someone and I'm like, okay, this doesn't really come through. And they're like, oh, and then they verbally tell me everything that makes it make sense. And I'm like, that's great. It has to be in the book, not just in your head. And we often don't realize how much is in our head versus in the book. So when you're looking to make sure you've done the resolution or you've resolved the plot arc, ask yourself, is this really in what I've written? All right, voice. Voice is your unique fingerprint on how you tell things. It's something that develops as we write. Some of us have really, really distinctive voices. Some of us have less distinctive voices. It is what it is, and there is plenty of room for very unique voices out there. What you need is consistency. Does it stay the same from point to point? This doesn't mean that you always write the same way. Like when I'm writing an action scene, my sentences get very short, very pointed. It can almost be like flash, very quick pans of the camera, almost like flash photography a little bit, stop action, because I'm trying to build that tension. And then I go back to the other. But my word choice often stays pretty similar, and that is actually part of my voice to tighten up during an action scene, although I suggest everyone do it. So make sure that you've stayed consistent. Even read it out loud to yourself, like read from the back, read from the front. As you edit through, make sure that it feels like you. Like you might read some stuff and be like, oh, I don't sound like that anymore. It's okay to just drop down, give yourself a few spaces, and retype that paragraph. But that gets more into line by line. I'm only bringing up voice because it needs to be looked at in the structure, but you'll need to relook at it when you're doing line editing. Make sure that you're using a voice that serves the story you're telling. If you're telling a tragedy, do you want to use a snarky voice? Because that's going to change like the difference of the tragedy. If you're telling a love story that's very sweet, but you're telling it from a voice that, a narrator's voice that's, very snarky and doesn't believe in love, that might work if that's the effect you're going for, but if it's not, you probably need to reconsider your voice. All right, point of view. Have you clearly settled on your point of view? This is your POV. I'm going to give you a couple rules of thumb here again. The more words you have in your book, the more point of views you can have. You do not need more than one, but you do need one. Your point of view could be an omnipresent narrator. That works. Your point of view could be your main character. That's pretty common. And you can choose third person, first person, check your genre, see what works, see what you can write well, but you need to settle on it. A good way to get an editor to pass your book back to you quietly and suggest you go over it again is to jump from point of view to point of view and not have consistency over the book. You can move from point of view to point of view, but make sure that they're the same points of view. There are a few books out there that do experiment, like telling every single chapter from a different point of view, and it becomes this greater story. But if that's what you're doing, you are using that as very strong structure. Most books will have 1 to 3 points of view, or if you're telling certain types of romance stories, you might have one point of view or both the love interest point of view. The most point of views I've ever written to a book is 6. That is a 240,000 dark fantasy epic. It requires a lot of planning and control, and I definitely used a lot of plotting. So make sure if you're telling a more intimate story, you're probably telling fewer point of views, mostly. And make sure you're telling it from a point of view that matters. Does it serve the story? If you can take a point of view out, take all the scenes out told from that character's perspective, then you probably don't need it, and it will only slow you down. Think about whether or not you need another point of view. Sometimes you reach the end of the book and you realize there would be a lot more tension in this book if I could see what the villain was doing. Well, the hero and the villain aren't in the same place. I would need another POV to tell me what's going on. So you can decide. You can tell a story from the perspective of a villain, especially if it's a secondary POV. Make sure you fully flesh that villain out as a character. Remember that villains are always the heroes of their own story. So give them that due. It will make the story a lot stronger. You don't want a POV that's going to spoil a secret or a surprise. So check to see if you're doing that. Do you have a POV in the story that's going to force you to reveal something? You can have a POV that knows a secret that you don't want to tell your character and just never have them think about that, but you have to handle that carefully. Make sure that your transitions are clearly marked. The last thing you want to do is be head hopping, because head hopping is when you move from one character's head to another character's head in the middle of the scene without any marked change. So like a paragraph change with like, I would usually put a little marker between the paragraphs, like one of those little motifs you see in books. In my epic fantasy, I actually have little images that correlate to each POV that start at the top of that character section, and they are chapter-sized sections. I stay with a POV for quite a while. So take some time, look at books that you like reading by other authors, see how they handle POV, and then be very conscious of what you're doing. When you're first writing, get it on the page. And when you come back, look at every scene. Does this scene need to be from this point of view? Would it be better from another point of view? All right, here's where we get down to the nuts and bolts, and I need to keep talking because we're running out of time. Editing for structure is not a linear process. You're going to move forward, you're going to move back. You need to spend a lot of time in the bird's eye view. You will not be editing directly on scenes at first. Again, right to the end, because the bird's eye view is not really possible until you've reached that end. Even if you change your end while you are editing for structure, you still need to have gotten there so you can look at it. I always suggest that before you start what I'm going to talk about in the next few slides, that you let the manuscript rest for 1 to 4 weeks at least. 1 week is really my minimum, because you need to step back, you need to let your subconscious work, and you need to be able to see everything with fresh eyes. While you're in it, you're really in the weeds, and you really can't see everything. All right, we're going to talk about maps first. Bird's eye view again. Here's what you need: blank paper, printouts of maps if you can find them, or so if you're like setting this in a modern day city, so you can go get yourself a map of that city. You'll need tape, a wall if possible, or a large desk or table. I do suggest having this up on the wall while you're writing, if at all possible. It will save you time. And you can also like just look at it and stare at it and think about things. Whiteout is amazing because you're going to be marking this map up, and you can just get rid of the things that no longer work for you. You don't want to feel like you can't make a mistake. Colored pencils, pens, Sharpies, or felt pens, whatever works for you. I would also include Post-it notes for things that you don't want to put directly on the map, things that you want to move around. And I suggest the fearlessness of a 3-year-old. If you do not have the fearlessness of a 3-year-old, get your moral supportive choice, be that a glass of wine or chocolate or whatever you need. Have fun with this. You're going back to kindergarten to edit your book. This is a picture of one of my maps. As you can see, it is liberally coated with Post-it notes as I figure things out. And I have actually put like little markers. I have different kinds of Post-it notes on there showing the directions people travel. Those needed to be stickies because they were going to move. The story covers years of time, so they move back and forth a lot. And you just have fun with it. It can be really intimidating to make a map, but only you have to see it. You're not necessarily going to do a presentation and show everyone your private work like I have. So just have fun with it. And if you are like, oh, I can't draw to scale, or I couldn't find a map online to print out, that's okay. Just write in the miles. Don't worry about writing the scale at first. If you need to redraw the map, that's okay. Literally just have fun with it. One good way to get like large maps of the world that doesn't have every line on it is actually educational printables. So you can go online and just look. You have Google Maps, you have the old paper maps, whatever you need. There's a lot of options. If you're in a purely fantasy secondary world, I would suggest D&D sites like Dungeons and Dragons, tabletop gaming. They have a lot of technical tools where you can make your own map as well if you want to play around with that. All right, tools, timelines. So timelines kind of bleed into plots too. You can do both in the same place if you want, but this is what I said we would come back to later. You need large pieces of paper, multicolored Post-it notes. You'll need a color for each group or group of characters you're tracking. Not just characters that are talking or your main characters, but anyone you need to know where they are at. So the value of this is that you can't really lie to yourself. If someone is here and then they have to be somewhere else, it's very obvious how many hours or days it is between things, and you can use your map in your timeline to decide if you have written yourself into a corner or have a plot hole. The how. The first 25% is your setup. You have to establish your setting. You might have a second setting later on in the book, that's okay, but you definitely have to establish your first one. If possible, introduce your second one. This is where you meet the characters. You try to introduce as many of the important characters here as you can. So the reader's going to bond you. The reader is going to decide whether or not to continue reading your book in the first 25%. They may decide in the first page. When I first started writing, most of the old books I read about writing was like, you had 3 pages to catch the reader. I would say in a Kindle Reads world and Kindle books, greater access to stories online, you probably have about a paragraph to 3 paragraphs to catch a reader. So there's that first page, and then you have the first 25%. So one more time, setting, characters, you have to establish what the stakes are, you have to establish what the goals are. In your second, at the end of the 25% is going to be, a marked change. Something's going to flip, and the character is going to move into the second part. So this flip is often a point of no return, where they are definitely on the quest, the mission. They can't go back to their old world and be the same as when they started. That can be their own decision. It can be something else. I usually push people towards saying, make sure that it's the character's decision on some level, even if it's reluctant or coerced, because a character that makes decisions is somewhat more compelling. But there are ways around it, depending on what kind of story you're telling. The next 25%, you're going to have a lot of build-up. This is where you get into the middle. This is where characters are trying and failing at things, and also learning and discovering things and adding to their group, adding tools that they're going to need later on in the book. By the 50% mark, there should be some sort of turning point again, where something is never going to be the same again. It can be very subtle, or it can be as large as the last 2 Avenger movies, where that scene where Thanos clicks his fingers and half the life in the universe goes out. That is the 50% mark, because the second movie is the second 50%. It's really one long movie. So if you ever want to think about how to set it up, those 2 movies make it really obvious where the percentage marks are in storytelling progression. And then you have the last third. This is where the character really should be stepping into their own and becoming who they're going to be. They're making changes. If they were a coward before, they're definitely trying to not be a coward now. They may not be successful at it. You don't want them successful too early necessarily, at least not on the main thing they're working on. They can be failing towards success. And then the last fourth, this is your crisis. This is the barrel towards the end. This is where you have your final showdown. This is where you wrap everything up. So I could talk about this for a couple of hours, and I have with some of my writers. I would tell you, go read Great Stories Don't Write Themselves by Larry Brooks. It might be a little bit intimidating, but he has a lot of pictures that show you exactly what he's talking about, and he explains things very clearly. I cannot recommend his book enough. All right, process, the how. So as you're editing, this will take many passes. Like I said, it's not a linear progression. Ask, if you're trying to double check yourself in the big ways, ask yourself, have I told a quarter of my storyline in a quarter of the words? You don't want all your words ending up in one part of your storyline or another. Look at it and literally just do very simple math. Break your word count up in 4 parts and see where you are in the progression of your story arc, and see if you've bloated any one part of your story. Again, check to see if there's any scenes that you yourself find boring. Cut those scenes, whether or not you need them in your book, cut them early in the structural process and make a note of what information is in that scene that needs to be found somewhere else in the story now. Because if you don't like the scene, probably no one else is going to like it. Make sure you don't rush over anything to, quote, get to the good stuff or the exciting parts of the story. If there's something you feel you need to rush over, it probably shouldn't be in the book. You probably need to spend more time with that plot and make it something that the reader's going to want to spend time with, that you want to spend time writing. Anything that's not interesting to you, again, is not interesting to other people. And then I would strongly suggest keep a writing journal near you. It's not something you have to write in every day, but it is something that you can keep track of notes that come to you, because we'll have ideas and then they go. We'll tell ourselves, oh, that's so good, I'm gonna remember it. You're probably not. Write it down, and then you can come back and you'll be like, oh, what did I need to edit? Like, I keep this journal running as I'm writing, and then I literally use it when I'm editing. All right, endings and beginnings. We don't really have enough time to cover this, but I will say compare them to each other and make sure that you have actually written an end for the same book you wrote a beginning for. Oftentimes people will get to the end and realize, I'm kind of telling a different story. Me, even though I plot now and I've been writing for 22 years, I usually end up either rewriting the end or rewriting the beginning to make sure I've really made these two match. So in the soggy middle, if you find that you're looking at your book at the end, you're doing the structural edit, and you're like, oh, this middle's not working, it's probably an Act 1 problem. It's probably a first 25% problem. Make sure that you set things up so that there are natural problems for you to write about in the next part. Make sure that there are conflicts. There are conflicts of interest, conflicts of character, tension, personalities. Make sure the stakes are high, and then have people fail forward, or actually just fall flat on their faces, and it will make the middle more interesting. Again, I write more about this in the handbook. Okay, editing for subject matter. We are not subject experts on everything as writers. So we might end up writing about a surgery and we've never done one. Unless we have, in which case, awesome. You are much more equipped to write medical thrillers than anyone else. Edit around it, but do this respectfully. Think about it, all right? Is there something I'm really good at that I wouldn't want someone else to write in a shoddy manner about? If you need to like have a cut scene or not look at it or write around it, so like you mentioned he went in and did surgery, unless it's important to the plot and you can change the plot if you need to, don't have a detailed description of surgery if you haven't really done your research. Get curious, consult experts when you need to. We can learn a lot. Just be really conscious of it, and don't assume that your reader's just going to ride along with you. Assume that your readers know more than you do, at least to a point, because some of them will. Like my brother has been an EMT. He will definitely tell me if I messed up on something like that. All right, editing for subject matter, race, minorities, disabilities. This happens quite a lot, and it's getting attention now. So it's definitely not something that you want to get bashed for once you've published. Think about it in terms of lived experience. You want to consult, you want to get input, you want to spend time learning about any of these issues that you include in your book. They make our books richer, and they make them deeper, and they definitely can bond readers to you. They can also turn readers off. So don't think just because you're writing a secondary world fantasy or sci-fi that people won't still apply their own lived experience to the book. So if someone has, like me, seizures in a sci-fi book, I'm still going to read it from the perspective that seizures work the same. Maybe the medical stuff is different, and I will totally accept that, but I'm still going to be like, oh, do they actually know about this? Or someone who's deaf or hard of hearing, make sure that you actually know the fact that, like, for facial expressions are important. If they're using ASL, you should know what ASL is. Give it some time. We all have biases, so take some time and look at yours. If it's really hard to look at them, but I do this myself, really I do. So when I'm talking about these questions, it's not a judgment thing. It's just the fact that we all have perspectives, and those perspectives mean we don't have other perspectives. And we need time to think about this when we're writing characters that aren't exactly like us. Now, we all actually have our own unique perspectives, our own unique communities that we live in, and we write about it from that. But when we're writing about others, we need to think about it. So again, here are some questions. I'll go through them very briefly. Have I killed off a woman or minority character just to move the plot forward, or a man or majority race character? Have I vilified with someone with minority status, and is this the only representation of that minority in the story? These are things that we do naturally. These are things that, depending on what literature or background we come from, we might not even realize we're doing it, because we've been exposed to so much literature that is doing it already. So just take these questions. They're all in the handbook. I'm not going to go over them all now. Ask them yourself, and give yourself the freedom to be uncomfortable. Like, I use these on my own writing, and I belong to a couple minority groups, and it can still be uncomfortable to be like, oh, I fell into that trap. Just give yourself space, and if you need to, try to find subject matter experts. All right, a note on getting feedback. Be careful who you ask. Really be careful who you ask. I've been at this over 20 years, and I can still mess myself up if I ask the wrong person to read my work before I'm ready to have armor around it. Don't ask someone who doesn't care about your genre or doesn't like it. Or someone with no history of reading your genre can give you advice that is really much more applicable to a genre they like and could turn readers off in the genre that you're writing in. Anyone who's hypercritical, probably not a great choice. And someone who just says yes and tells you how awesome you are all the time, not a great choice. My mom is not someone I need to get feedback from. She reads my books on her own time, and she likes all of them, which is amazing, but it's not going to help me grow as a writer. You want to ask people in your target demographic. You want to ask other writers in your genre who can be constructive. And you want to ask people who will return your work in agreed upon frame of time. I've definitely had friendships where, like, someone was a year later still apologizing about not turning it back in. It happens. It doesn't mean they're not your good friends. Just know that you shouldn't ask them again. When to seek professional services after you've done everything in these slides and in the handbook, because it will save you money, especially for a developmental edit, a structural edit. The editor, someone like me, will have to do all of this themselves, and the more that you have left to do to get the book to a publishable level, the more work we have to do, and we will have to charge you for it because we have to pay our bills too. And a structural edit takes time. I will go through a book a minimum of 2 times, if not 3 or 4. You can do this. Editing for structure is writing. Writing is editing, editing is writing. And I find it to be really, really rewarding. If you're intimidated by it, just give yourself permission to be intimidated and go play. You're not going to mess your story up. You can always save the first copy, start a new copy, and mess that one up as much as you want. You'll actually be helping yourself. Just give yourself freedom to play with it. If you want professional feedback, but you're not ready to like dive in and have your full book looked at, I do offer a first 5 package where I look at the first 5,000 words of your story and give you a mini critique that will help you focus what you need to work on for yourself. And it will include ways that you can continue educating yourself, resources and stuff for that are specifically tailored to you if you need that. But there we go.
Well, what an amazing session from Bethany. She really, really knows her stuff. You can tell that she's been writing and editing for many, many years now. And if you like what she says and how she explains things and you'd like to find out more about her, then please do go to her website, The Art and Science of Words, which you'll find a link to in the show notes. And of course, if you're looking for somebody who can maybe have a look at your first 5,000 words, again, get in touch with Bethany and she'll be able to guide you on that. She's a mastermind all in herself. I really enjoy talking with Bethany. I learn so much from her with every conversation we have. So please do go and check out her website. And of course, her podcast, Doing Diversity in Writing. If you're interested in writing characters that are out with your own experience, then this is a great podcast to listen to. All right, take care for now, and I'll see you soon. Bye.